At first glance, Kazum was just another hard-working soul, with humble beginnings, had skilled hands, and a growing list of loyal customers. His little business rose faster than anyone expected, almost unnaturally fast. But behind the scent of fresh starch and the hiss of his iron, a sinister truth simmered. Customers who brought their clothes to Kazum began to change, losing more than just wrinkles. Their fortunes faded. Their health declined. Their joy pressed away. What no one knew was that Kazum had mastered more than just fabric. He had found a way to press out virtue, wealth, and destiny from their garments, and into his own. How did he do it? Why? And can he ever be stopped? Find out as this chilling story unfolds. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, turn on the notification bell, and like this video, so you never miss more thrilling tales like this one. Let's dive in. In the heart of Abulojah stood a peculiar dry cleaning shop, modest in size but immense in reputation. It was a low, rectangular building of faded blue paint and a slanted tin roof, where the faint smell of starch and burning coal always hung thick in the air. Over the entrance swung a hand-painted sign, Kazum's Premium Laundry, excellence in every fold. The townsfolk spoke of it with admiration, of course, but also with something more, something like awe and fear. The man behind the sign, Kazum was a figure quietly dreaded. A tall man with skin color like that of polished mahogany, Kazum moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who knew exactly where he was going and feared nothing in this world or beyond it. He wore simple kaftans, always spotlessly white, his head crowned with a small, neatly tied black cap, and his eyes, oh, his eyes, were deep-set, dark, and endless, as if he peered through the skin and bones of everyone he met. In the early days, when he first opened his shop, Kazum had been just another young man with strong arms and an iron heart, offering his services to weary market women, busy traders, and the well-to-do. But soon, far too soon, some whispered, his business exploded beyond what was natural, which made him change location into the main town. Customers flowed into his shop like ants to sugar, women carrying delicate lace wrappers and embroidered head ties, men bringing heavy agbatas stitched with golden thread. Even the town's rich and powerful, who would normally never stoop to using a common dry cleaner, came quietly with their garments wrapped in brown paper. At first, it was the quality that drew them, clothes that smelled of heaven itself, pressed so finely that even the folds seemed to sing under the sun. But then came the changes, subtle at first. A woman named Madame Eben, wealthy and proud, returned after collecting her ironed iro and buba, and within a month, she began to waste away, coughing and muttering nonsense. Chief Alade, the biggest fish merchant in town, started bringing all his brocade garments to Kazum. Not long after, his sons turned against him, and his thriving business crumbled like bread left in the rain. None of these things were tied openly to Kazum, of course. Who would suspect the humble dry cleaner? But in the little stalls of the market, in the tight courtyards where old women chewed kola nuts and gossiped, his name began to be spoken with careful lips. "There is something inside that shop," they said. "Something beyond cloth and water and soap." Kazum, meanwhile, expanded. He employed a team of 6 workers. Tay, the young rebel with a scar across his left eyebrow, forever curious, forever restless. Saad, the sharp-tongued girl who washed faster than anyone else, but whose eyes missed nothing. Kunal, thick-necked and silent, whose fists could crush yams like melons. Mama Ronk, the matronly woman who prepared the starch mixtures and sang old Yoruba songs under her breath. Idris, a skinny boy with quick hands and a quicker mouth. Folasade, the shy newcomer who never raised her voice but seemed to see things others missed. They all worked under Kazum's strict command. They could wash, they could soak, they could rinse and dry. But when it came to ironing, only Kazum touched the clothes. No matter how many heaps of clothing stacked up, no matter how exhausted Kazum looked, he forbade anyone else from laying a hand on the irons. Every day around noon, after washing was complete, Kazum would lock himself in the back room, the ironing room. The workers would speak in whispers, and stay there for hours. When he emerged, sweat-slicked and wide-eyed, all the garments would be miraculously ironed to perfection. And every day, the pile of customers outside his shop grew longer and longer. But along with the customers grew the fear. People who once strutted through Abulojah in fine clothes and loud voices came back after a few visits to Kazum's shop, shriveled. Their eyes hollowed. Their fortunes disappeared like salt in the rain. Some took to their beds and never rose again. And some simply wandered away, lost in their own town, muttering to themselves and pulling at invisible threads on their once proud clothes. Tay noticed first. He watched as Mr. Bamadil, the richest cocoa merchant, brought in his grand buba and Sokoto set, gleaming like treasure under the morning sun. Tay watched Bamadil's proud back disappear through the gates, only to hear, a month later, that the man had been found dead, collapsed in the corner of his own warehouse, surrounded by broken bottles. Then Saad noticed too. She washed the fine lace of Auntie Remy, the woman who once laughed so loud you could hear her 3 streets away. But after her third visit to Kazum's laundry, Auntie Remy sat in front of her house all day, staring blankly at the dust, while her children cried for food. The workers gathered in secret one night, under the great twisted baobab tree that loomed behind the shop. The moon carved pale scars across their faces as they spoke in low, fearful voices. "It's the ironing," Tay said, his voice barely a breath. "It's not just pressing cloth. He's pressing something else out of them." "Their luck?" Idris asked, his wide eyes rounder than ever. "Their lives," Saad whispered. "Piece by piece." Kunal cracked his knuckles, staring off into the darkness. "We must see what he does," he said. "Before it is our own souls he folds into his irons." But how to spy on Kazum, who locked himself away like a king hiding treasures? Who guarded his secrets with the quiet ruthlessness of a crocodile in still water? It would take cunning, bravery, and perhaps the sacrifice of more than one soul. The plan was simple, but simple plans are often the most dangerous. They would watch Kazum closely, take shifts after hours, and most of all, never let him know they were watching. For if Kazum suspected even for a moment, who knew what unspeakable fate might befall them? Tay volunteered first. That night, long after the shop closed and the streets emptied into silence, he crouched behind the mound of old coal sacks by the back window. He dared not light a torch, dared not even shift his weight on the creaking floorboards. He simply waited, sweat dripping from his forehead even as the night grew cold. 4 hours, nothing moved. The dry sound of crickets scraped the darkness. The faint smell of burning starch still lingered. Then, just as Tay began to fear he would fall asleep, he heard it, the creaking of the forbidden ironing room door. Through a crack in the dusty window pane, Tay saw Kazum step into the dim lamplight. But he was not alone. There, standing on either side of him, were two shadowy figures, tall, impossibly thin, their arms like broken branches, their faces hidden in darkness. They hovered over the ironing board, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. Kazum placed a freshly washed garment, a shimmering blue booba, on the board. As he lifted the iron, the air thickened, growing heavy like wet cloth. The iron itself glowed faintly, a sickly green hue that seemed to pulse with life. Tay clamped a hand over his mouth to stop the scream rising from his chest. The moment Kazum pressed the iron down onto the cloth, a low moan filled the room, a sound so filled with sorrow, so laden with despair, that Tay's vision blurred with tears. It was as if the garment itself wept. Or worse, as if something trapped inside it was crying out. And as Kazum moved the iron slowly, methodically, back and forth, the two shadowy figures leaned closer, their mouths stretching open in silent, greedy laughter. Something rose from the fabric, a faint mist, golden and shimmering, and wound itself around the figures before vanishing into the brown suitcase that sat at the foot of the ironing table. Tay stumbled backward, heart hammering, nearly toppling the coal sacks. But Kazum did not look up. He was lost in his dark work, his face gleaming with sweat, his eyes rolling back in ecstasy as he pressed again and again, stealing whatever unseen treasure lay hidden in the cloth. Tay fled into the night, not stopping until he reached the old baobab tree where the others waited. Panting, he poured out everything he had seen. The color drained from Sada's face. Idris whimpered like a whipped dog. Kunal merely clenched his fists so tight that his knuckles cracked like breaking stones. "Spirits," Mama Ronk said finally, her voice hoarse. "Dark ones. He has bound spirits to his irons. He uses them to draw out the essence of those who trust him." "And the suitcase?" Falisaid asked in a whisper. "What is inside it?" "Their lives," Mama Ronk said. "Their wealth. Their destiny. Folded up like spare cloth." They sat in terrified silence as the night deepened, as the stars blinked coldly overhead. They knew what they had to do. They must find a way to destroy the suitcase. Without it, perhaps Kazum's power would break, and the spirits would scatter. But how could they get close? How could they survive even touching something so steeped in death and darkness? They would need help. Help from someone who understood things beyond the washing of cloth and the beating of garments against stone. And there was only one person in Abulojah who might dare such a thing. Baba Alawo, the old herbalist who lived on the edge of the forest, whose hut was said to walk at night, whose medicine could cure, or kill, depending on how you asked. It was decided, Saad and Tay would go to him the next morning, before Kazum even stirred from sleep. But fate, that old trickster, had other plans. Because that night, as the town lay wrapped in uneasy dreams, Kazum had a dream of his own. A dream where his brown suitcase burned in a fire made not of wood, but of betrayal. And when he woke, he knew, with the certainty of a knife plunged into flesh, that someone among his workers had seen what was not meant to be seen. He rose from his bed with a slow, deadly calm, lit a single black candle, and whispered into the folds of his spotless white caftan. The candle guttered and hissed, and from the shadows of the ironing room, The two thin spirits slithered forth, eager and hungry. He gave them one command: find the traitor. At the first blush of dawn, when the sky was still a bruised purple and the air smelled faintly of night dew, Tay and Sod slipped away from the dry cleaner's shop and made their way to the edge of Abulojah. The forest loomed ahead, black and gnarled, whispering secrets to the morning wind. There, nestled among the twisted roots of an ancient Irako tree, stood the crooked hut of Baba Alawo. The hut was a strange sight, small yet sprawling, made of mud and bone and cloth, with charms and talismans dangling from every crooked beam. Little calabashes filled with herbs swung gently from the rafters, and the doorway was flanked by two carved statues with empty eyes. As they approached, the door swung open with a groan. "Enter," came a voice from within, dry, brittle, and commanding. Inside, the darkness was thick and warm, lit only by the flickering of a fire that smoked greenish tendrils into the low ceiling. In the center sat Baba Alawo himself, ancient, with skin like old tree bark, eyes sharp as flint, and a smile that showed teeth stained black with kola nut. He wore a simple wrapper of rough cloth and a necklace of bones that clicked softly when he moved. Tay and Sod knelt respectfully before him, their foreheads touching the dusty ground. "Speak," Baba Alawo rasped. "Tell me why you have come before the spirits have had their breakfast." Tay lifted his head. With shaking hands and a voice that cracked, he told the whole story: the cursed ironing, the shadowy spirits, the brown suitcase that swallowed lives. Sod added what she had seen: the decline of their customers, the sudden poverty and death that followed visits to Kazum's shop. Baba Alawo listened in silence, his eyes gleaming like twin coals. When they finished, he leaned forward, and the firelight danced across the deep ridges of his face. "Kazum has made a pact," he said slowly. "Long ago, when he first sought fortune, he called upon spirits of scarcity, the Alakunkan. They promised him wealth, customers, success, but the price was blood and destiny. Every garment he irons, he steals a piece of the owner's soul." Tay swallowed hard. Sod pressed a trembling hand against her chest. "And the suitcase?" Sod whispered. "A vessel," Baba Alawo said. "A prison. All the stolen fortunes are trapped there, like smoke in a calabash." Tay leaned forward, desperation burning in his chest. "Can we destroy it? Can we free the souls?" Baba Alawo nodded slowly. "But it will not be easy. You must strike during the final pressing." "Final pressing," they echoed. The old man's voice grew low, heavy with dread. "When the moon dies and is reborn, 3 nights from now, Kazum will perform a great pressing. He will seal all the fortunes he has stolen and feed them to his spirits, gaining power beyond human limits. If you destroy the suitcase before the last pressing is complete, you can end it. If you fail—" He trailed off, his black teeth flashing in the firelight. "None of you will leave alive." He reached into the folds of his wrapper and pulled out 2 items: a small mirror framed in iron and a thin dagger carved from bone. "The mirror will show you what the eyes cannot see," he said. "The dagger can cut through spirit bindings. But be warned, use them wisely, or they will turn against you." Tay and Sod took the gifts with trembling hands, bowed deeply, and fled back into the growing light of morning. But even as they plotted, Kazum was already moving. The spirits he had sent out the night before had slithered through dreams and whispers, sniffing out the scent of betrayal. By noon, he stood before his workers, smiling that slow, cold smile that never reached his hollow eyes. "Today," he said, "we celebrate." His voice was soft, oily. "You have all worked so hard. Tonight, after work, a feast. Meat, palm wine, as much as you can eat and drink." The workers cheered, clapping and laughing, but their hearts were heavy with suspicion. They knew better than to trust a crocodile offering fish. Still, they played their parts. They worked through the day, washing garment after garment, while Kazum ironed in his hidden room, the sickly green glow leaking out from under the door. Saad, Tay, Idris, Kunal, Mama Ronk, and Falisaid exchanged tense glances, their resolve hardening. The final night was coming. They had 3 days to prepare, or die trying. The nights that followed were tense beyond measure. Each night, they gathered under the baobab, away from prying eyes, to plan. Tay practiced using the bone dagger, slicing through hanging banana leaves that split like mist. Saad learned to use the mirror, holding it up to the ironing room from afar and watching the hidden spirits shift and writhe like worms under a stone. Kunal fashioned a makeshift shield from the lid of an old iron drum, layering it with charms Baba Alawo provided. Mama Ronk brewed powders and oils, whispering old incantations into them. They were preparing for war. A war fought not with swords and guns, but with belief, fear, courage, and spirit. Meanwhile, Kazum watched. Watched as they sweated under the sun, watched as they gathered their courage like dry tinder. And he smiled, because he, too, had prepared. And he knew that desperate mice are the easiest to trap. The first attack came the very next evening. It was small, barely a whisper compared to the storm that would come, but it was enough to send tremors through the workers' fragile courage. Idris had stayed late at the shop, pretending to finish a mountain of clothes. He was alone in the back room, scrubbing stubborn stains from a rich man's igbada, when he heard it, a soft scratching at the window. He froze, cloth clutched in his trembling hands. The scratching grew louder, faster, like fingernails dragging across a blackboard. Slowly, Idris turned toward the window. There, pressed against the glass, was a face, thin, pale, with empty black eyes and a mouth that stretched too wide. The face smiled, a horrible, knowing smile, and whispered his name. "Idrisis!" Idris screamed, dropping the cloth and stumbling backward. He bolted for the front door, crashing into chairs and knocking over buckets. But as he ran, the shadows in the room seemed to reach for him, thin fingers trying to catch his feet, his arms, his very breath. He only made it outside because Saad and Tay, hidden nearby, heard his scream and rushed to drag him into the street. Gasping and sobbing, Idris swore he would never, never stay alone again. The workers huddled together that night, clutching charms from Baba Alawo, whispering prayers into the darkness. But they knew it was just the beginning. Kazum was testing them. He wanted to see who would break first. The second attack was more vicious. 2 nights later, Mama Ronk was walking home after gathering herbs at the riverbank. The moon was a pale coin overhead, the road deserted. She hummed an old song to steady her nerves, the bag of herbs swinging from her hand. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted. It became soft, wet, like walking on a swamp. She stumbled, looking down, and gasped. The road had turned into a writhing mass of grasping hands, thin, white hands clawing up from the earth, clutching at her ankles, pulling at her wrapper. Mama Ronk screamed and thrashed, beating them off with her herb bag, but the more she struggled, the stronger they seemed to grow. They dragged her to her knees, cold fingers wrapping around her throat. In desperation, she fumbled in her bag, pulling out a gourd Baba Alawo had given her. With trembling fingers, she smashed it against the ground. The gourd burst in a cloud of white ash, and the hands recoiled, hissing and shrinking back into the earth. The ground hardened beneath her, solid once more. Panting and weeping, Mama Ronk staggered back to the shop, collapsing into Cunnel's arms. Her skin was scratched and torn, and her voice was hoarse from screaming. From then on, no one walked alone at night. Meanwhile, Kazum's business continued to thrive. More and more customers came, their faces bright with hope, their pockets heavy with money. And one by one, after a few visits to Kazum's shop, they would fade, growing poorer, weaker, sicker. Whispers spread through Abulojah. Some said it was curses. Some said it was bad luck. Only the workers knew the truth, that Kazum was feeding, growing fat on stolen lives. And still, the final night drew closer. The third attack was the worst yet, and it nearly destroyed them. On the eve of the new moon, Folktale fell ill. It started with a fever, a burning heat that left her delirious and shivering. Then came the visions. She screamed of shadow men clawing at her eyes, of a great iron pressing down on her chest, squeezing the life from her. The others did everything they could. They cooled her with wet cloths, fed her herbal teas, whispered prayers over her body. But nothing helped. Finally, desperate, Tay and Saad held up the mirror Baba Alawo had given them, angling it over Folktale's body. What they saw made Saad bite her fist to keep from screaming. A great black iron hovered above Folktale, an enormous pressing iron the size of a man, floating inches above her chest. It was ghostly, insubstantial, but real enough to steal her breath, to crush her spirit. And on the handle of the iron, crouched one of Kazum's thin, pale spirits, giggling madly as it pressed down, down, down. Tay, with trembling hands, grabbed the bone dagger. He whispered the words Baba Alawo had taught him and slashed at the spirit's shadow. There was a shriek like tearing silk. The iron shattered into mist. The spirit dissolved, hissing, into the air. Folktale gasped, drawing in great, shuddering breaths. Her fever broke within minutes. But the workers knew now, Kazum was no longer content to scare them. He meant to kill. The final night was upon them. The new moon hung like a cold, black void in the sky. The workers stood together under the baobab, armed with their charms, their courage, and their fear. They knew what they had to do. That night, when Kazum gathered them all for the so-called feast, they would strike. They would sneak into the ironing room. They would find the brown suitcase. They would destroy it before Kazum could complete his final pressing. And if they failed, they would never leave Abulojah alive. The night air was thick, heavy with the scent of roasting meat and the tang of palm wine. Kazum had spared no expense. Huge fires burned in iron drums around the compound, casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. Tables groaned under the weight of food, roasted goat, spicy jollof rice, steaming yam porridge, bowls of fresh fruits glistening with honey. Palm wine flowed like a river, filling calabashes faster than men could empty them. The workers gathered in small groups, pretending to laugh, pretending to feast. But their eyes stayed sharp, darting nervously as they gazed at the door where the ironing room lay hidden. Kazum himself stood in the center of it all, resplendent in a white agbada embroidered with gold. He moved from table to table, clapping men on the back, laughing with a mouth full of shining teeth. But behind his laughter, there was a tension, a waiting. Because tonight was the night. Tonight, Kazum would seal his power. And he knew, oh yes, he knew, someone intended to stop him. Tay gripped the iron-framed mirror hidden under his wrapper, feeling its strange, cold thrum against his palm. Saad kept the bone dagger tucked into the sash at her waist. Idris, Kunal, Mama Ronk, and Falasaid watched for Kazum's movements, ready to act. The plan was simple. Saad and Tay would slip away during the feast, sneak into the ironing room, find the brown suitcase, and destroy it. The others would create distractions if needed. Fights, spills, noise. Everything had to be perfect. One mistake, and it was over. They waited until Kazum was deep in conversation with the village chief, an old, greedy man already half-drunken on wine. Kunal, large and loud, staged a clumsy fall near the fire, sending sparks flying and causing a roar of laughter. Mama Ronk and Falasaid rushed to help him, deliberately knocking over a table of wine calabashes in the process. In the chaos, Tay and Saad slipped away, unnoticed. Or so they thought. The ironing room was colder than they remembered, even though no wind touched it. The door creaked as they pushed it open. Inside, the room was lit only by the pale green glow of strange glyphs painted on the walls. Mountains of clothes lay neatly folded on tables. And in the center of the room, on a low, blood-stained pedestal, sat the brown suitcase. It seemed to hum with a terrible, living energy. The air around it rippled, and ghostly faces twisted across its surface, wailing soundlessly. Tay raised the mirror. The reflection showed what the naked eye could not. Thick chains of spirit energy binding the suitcase to the room, to the clothes, to Kazum himself. Saad drew the bone dagger, her hand shaking. "We have to be quick," she whispered. Together, they stepped forward, and the door slammed shut behind them. Kazum stood there, smiling. But it was not the smile of a man. It was the smile of something older, darker, something wearing a man's skin like a fine cloth. His eyes blazed red. His fingers twisted into claws. "Did you think I did not see?" Kazum's voice was layered now, two voices speaking at once, the human voice and the deeper gurgling voice of something from far beyond. He raised one hand. The mountains of folded clothes shivered, and from within them rose his spirits. Thin, long-limbed things with pale skin, eyeless faces, and iron-sharp claws. They shrieked a sound that bent the walls, shaking the room. Tay and Saad backed toward the suitcase, brandishing the mirror and dagger. But the spirits closed in fast, their claws scraping the stone floor like knives across bone. Just as one spirit lunged, a figure burst into the room. It was Idris, panting, wild-eyed, clutching a bundle of charms. "Now! Strike now!" he screamed. Tay raised the dagger, and stabbed at the nearest spirit. The dagger tore through the spirit like paper, and it howled, dissolving into smoke. Sod swung the mirror at another, and where the reflection touched it, the spirit shrieked and withered. Kazum snarled and raised both arms. The walls of the ironing room seemed to melt, revealing a vast black void beyond, a place where countless more spirits howled, eager to be unleashed. In the middle of the chaos, Tay reached the suitcase. He raised the bone dagger high. But then, a hand caught his wrist. It was Folktale. Her face was twisted with grief and guilt. "Don't," she sobbed. "You don't understand. If you destroy it, he'll kill all our families. He has their souls too." Tay's heart faltered. The dagger trembled in his hand. Kazum laughed, a booming, awful sound that shook the room. "Poor girl," he crooned. "She only wanted to save her mother. Her brothers." Tay stared at Folktale, seeing the terrible truth in her tear-filled eyes. Betrayal. But also desperation. She wasn't evil. She was trapped, like all of them. "Forgive me," Tay whispered, and yanked free. With all his strength, he plunged the bone dagger into the suitcase. The room exploded in light. A blinding, searing light that peeled the shadows from the walls, that burned the spirits into ash. Kazum screamed, a sound that tore the soul from the body. The suitcase writhed, cracking open along its seams. From within poured a river of golden mist, faces, voices, memories, all rushing out into the air. The stolen fortunes. The trapped souls. They surged past Tay and Sod, rushing out into the world, into the night sky, into freedom. Kazum staggered backward, his flesh bubbling, peeling away like old paint. The man beneath was revealed, a withered, twisted creature, shriveled and blackened. He fell to his knees, clutching at the air, and then collapsed into dust. Gone. The ironing room shuddered. The walls cracked. The house began to collapse. Tay grabbed Sada's hand. They ran, dragging Folktale, sobbing, behind them. They burst out into the cool night air just as the roof caved in with a roar. The villagers stared, wide-eyed and silent, as the ground where Kazum's shop once stood cracked and split, and from it rose a strange green tree, heavy with fat, whispering leaves. A symbol. A warning. A new beginning. In the days that followed, Abulojah changed. Kazum's spell was broken. The customers he had drained began to heal, their fortunes slowly returning, their spirits growing bright again. The workers stayed together, bound forever by what they had endured. Tay and Sod opened a new laundry, the honest kind. Mama Ronk brewed her herbs. Kunnel built a real workshop. Even Idris laughed again. And Folktale spent her time in the market selling fabrics. Some nights, under the silver light of the new moon, the villagers swore they could hear the tree whispering, telling stories of courage, of betrayal, of victory, and of a dry cleaner who thought he could own the souls of others, but lost his own instead.